Please welcome Dr. Mauro Rodriguez.
All right, so welcome back to the second module regarding the National Chapter Program. And in this particular module, we're going to go into detail regarding the chapter management tool. And so this is subtitled Chapter Management and Planning. So let's go into it. And so as similar as before, by the end of this module, you'll be able to communicate the value of the National Chapter Program, the basics of the SHIP chapter ecosystem. You'll be able to educate your members on why, how, what of the NCP, and in particular, the chapter management tool. And you'll be able to use that chapter management tool to lead your members throughout the year. And so let me talk about in detail about the chapter planning process. Okay, it's a three-step process. You're going to do the SWOT analysis, then you'll plan, and then you will develop that plan into a schedule, a system, a habit, if you will, and then you'll be able to learn how to run some effective meetings. Okay, and so the first step for the SWOT analysis is to really understand the SHIP member value proposition. And a lot of this, almost everything I show you here, is going to be a formalization on how to do proper introspection, reflection, as to how you organize your events. And so, yes, I'm going to ask you to think. It's a rather challenging process to ask you to think, and that's usually the first step to becoming a leader, and that is to learn to think really, really hard about how you operate, how all of you in your chapter, whether you be professionals in a community-based or city-based chapter, or professionals in an employee resource group, or a university that is a Hispanic serving institution, or a university that is with a very small SHIP chapter, whatever the case may be for your SHIP chapter, you should always take the time to follow proper introspection, or have a formalism for proper introspection of your chapter's activities, what you do, how you could be doing it better, etc. Knowing on the back of the mind that you should be a realist, you should be pragmatic in the way that you organize yourself, but not letting that be such an inhibitor to say no to everything. In many ways, a leader is one that has a vision of what needs to be achieved and recognizes that despite the odds, despite the incredible ways of everyone else, including yourself, saying no, you end up saying, it's going to work out. We're going to make it happen. And so, in a certain way, here today, I'm going to show you how to do this. It may be a very tall task on my end as well, but I'll tell myself as well that it's going to work out. It's going to be okay. So let's go ahead and try to understand the SHIP member value proposition, the MVP. Okay, what is the value that we provide to the members, leading straight into their selfish desires, which is a good thing. It's a good thing to be selfish when it's all aligned with the SHIP mission. Okay, and so when discussing the SWOT analysis, the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, and I'll tell you a little bit more about each of these, I first want to talk about the value that we provide to the members and how it's also, as you saw in the prior module, a cycle. It's all cyclical. We want to create these virtuous cycles as much as possible. And you might still ask yourself, why? Why is Professor Rodriguez so focused on creating these virtuous cycles? The reason why, and I perhaps should have covered this in the prior module, is because we have sufficient number of vicious cycles not only within our community, within the external factors that affect our community, that we have to counter them. And within our own local ecosystems, there are many vicious cycles. Many of them are vicious cycles of the mind that affect our ability to ensure the upward mobility, the empowerment of our members. And so we must be able to construct proper introspective systems or frameworks that enables us to build virtuous cycles. And so to do that, we also develop another cycle, a virtuous cycle. And so we have here just a three-step process. I want you to think about the value you provide to the members to them to succeed. To think about intrinsically about that value, the concept, the idea of what you provide. So for example, if it's a resume building workshop, just the aspect of building the resume, the aspect of offering a resume building workshop to your members. Let us not get too caught up yet on how you organize it and implement it. That's coming up next. but I want you to think first about the value itself. Is this valuable to the members? Okay. Ask yourself this. You're going to get some answers later, but ask yourself this and pause. Would this be valuable to you? Whatever value you currently provide? Is there more value elsewhere? Or rather, are there other things you could be doing that are opportunity costs that are far more, that have greater worth than what you're already doing? It's important to ask yourself. It's a difficult question. I encourage you not to dismiss it so simply. Many chapter leaders do. They simply say, or former chapter leaders, or sometimes very heavily inexperienced chapter leaders do. They dismiss it immediately and say, oh, yes, everything we do is fine, whatever. Okay. But if you really take the time to think about it, some of these things you may end up revisiting, questioning, and thinking about really hard. And that's part of leadership. You have to be able to think very, very hard about the value you provide. Could you be doing better? Okay. Now we can move on to the second aspect. After you answer some of these questions, I will give you a formalism of how to do this even further using SWOT, is to think about how you organized it and how you implemented the value. You could have a great idea, great value here, but it's just that the way that it was organized, the way it was implemented was very bad, was very poorly organized for the members. Okay, this happens often for whatever one way or another, right? But this should not be intrinsically coupled to the value that you're providing, okay? These things can be decoupled, right? So they're not exactly the same thing. And so you should think about that. And what I have learned is that chapters are really good at being critical, perhaps overly critical, about how they could have done this better, but they never really think about this over here. And so this is why I'm pointing this out first. Chapters think about, well, we've always done this workshop. It has always been like that since I got here, since the beginning of time. There's no reason why we should change it. Let's just keep it going for what it is. Let's not challenge the status quo. The first blue box I showed you challenges the status quo. The second blue box then asks you, now that you challenged it, and if you succeeded or haven't succeeded, if it remains the same, that's perfectly fine. And because some of these events that you're offering are already really, really strong, is the way that you offered it effective? And then you can think about, how are you evaluating all of these two questions? Is the way you're evaluating the value of that's being provided to the members strong or weak or non-existent, which is usually the root cause of some of the problems? And so you have to think about this. If you've never evaluated the value that you're providing to the members, this is where you need to start. You need to start gathering data. You need to ask members, what are we doing? How could we be doing it better? That's probably one of my favorite questions that when I see leaders asking is to say to their members, how could we be doing better? Right? In a certain sense, it's offshoring some of the responsibility. The leader should know better as well, but sometimes you don't. And sometimes you need to ask members for their opinions. And I think you should be asking their opinions more and more and very, very often. And so gathering this data is critical for you to understand. And it could all be internal data for your chapter alone on how you could be doing this better. Gathering that data then leads back into providing better value. And based on how you provide better value, you can organize it better as well for the members. It's all a virtuous cycle. You should consider your constituency as much as possible when doing the SWOT analysis. Think about the pre-college student, the freshman and sophomore and junior, senior graduates and alum. And here I just give you a 4 little buckets example. It doesn't have to be broken down this way. It's just 4 little audiences. Here I'm calling them buckets or boxes, right, that I've organized them. And you can see that I'm double dipping in a few of them. I put seniors here twice. I put sophomores here twice, right? And the different kinds of value that you could provide to each one of these individual groupings of members, right? It doesn't have to be done this way, but it's just an example of how you could do it. And then you could say, well, for these people, we're trying to recruit them as much as possible. These 2 major buckets or boxes or constituents. That's probably the most sophisticated word you should use, the constituents, right? You have 4 different types of constituents, all right? I'm going to call them boxes here just to keep it simple. And then there's these other 2 constituencies. You can call these the more senior constituents, and how you retain them in their activities through the year. So you go from a very high level breakdown, and then even more in-depth discussion of the events or the activities that you use when engaging with these members, and then you go back out to abstracting it even further and calling this recruitment activities and calling these retention activities. All of it aims towards their post-graduation success of the member. Okay, so you can see you can break it down this way in terms of the value that you provide. The value is being injected right here, right across here. This is the events and the activities that you do. Okay, but here's how the constituency engages, and here's how the major chapter activities interact. And so here I provide you a snapshot of what the glorified spreadsheet looks like for the SWOT analysis, and how it links from year to year. Here you have the SMART goals. This is from the previous year. You can just copy and paste. If you have not done the SWOT analysis in a long time, that's okay. Don't worry about these columns, okay? But if you did do it last year, you should just copy and paste what you discussed last year. What were your SMART objectives? What were the outcomes of those objectives? Why would you do this? Why would you just copy and paste the objectives that you did last year and the outcomes? So that way you have some context moving forward when looking at the SWOT analysis. Okay, what you're then going to do is just reflect. You're going to talk about the strong things, the internal aspects of your chapter, what you did that was really well, that worked really well for your members. How do you know it worked well for your members? It's a major question that you should be asking yourself. What didn't work? And this is something that chapter leaders are really good at, being self-critical. And I encourage you to have some of that criticism, but not be overly critical. And then talk about what opportunities you should be aware about and what are some of the threats. Now, you're going to do this for the value that you provide, how you organized and implemented that value, and then how you evaluate that value. And see, here you can see that I have a very large grid of boxes. You don't have to populate all of the boxes. What I encourage you to do is to have one specific idea, a notion, populated per box, and not have it be overcrowded in one specific cell. Okay, so have it spread out, but you don't need to populate all the cells. Another thing you could do is use these cells as sticky notes. And so you could create a grid on a wall, for example, one day in your chapter leader, amongst your chapter leaders, or on Zoom, right? Create a grid using a whiteboard, etc., and then create sticky notes and just use the sticky notes to have students, all of you, or the members, the professionals, just write down on a sticky note, one idea per sticky note, and write down in each one of them a strength of value provided, weaknesses, opportunities, perhaps a threat here or there, and then populate this as much as possible. It doesn't, again, you don't need to fill in every cell. And then you're done. You did the reflection, and then you can stand back. That's very important, that you stand back and you just look at the SWOT analysis. Once you finished it, many chapter leaders get so caught up in the inertia and the grogginess of having to do this analysis. But it's super vital to go through this introspection, to think hard as a leader. It's so important to think hard as a leader, because when you step back, you can finally see the bigger picture. And it's very important to see the bigger picture and say, okay, chapter leaders, you're the chapter leader as well, the president, etc. What do we see here in the SWOT analysis? What are we learning? And from that, we seeing here what we're good at, what we're really bad at, what are some things we got to take advantage of, and what do we got to watch out for, the threats? How do we construct a vision statement for the next year? What should a very lofty, very flowery language vision statement should we cast, should we create, should we write down for next year? And that's what you're going to write down here. Does it have to be a sentence? No. Does it have to be a complete sentence? Does it have to be a sentence in general? Does it have to follow the rules of the English language? No. And it could be just a phrase. It could be a thought. It could be something. But it's got to be something that you write down of what you want to accomplish. Come hell, heaven, whatever it may be, or high water, you want to make sure that this is completed. Okay, so that's the vision statement. And then from there, from your vision statement, from the things you want to make sure, one or two things you want to make sure you complete, you can start drafting some SMART objectives. Now, these have to be very carefully constructed. They have to be specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and timely. And I'll talk about that in the next 1 or 2 slides. But this vision statement here can be very lofty, but just the big picture stuff, just big picture. And then here, just write down some ideas, and then we're going to put these into the chapter schedule. Okay, so now let's begin to plan for the success of the SHPE member. Okay, so I'm going to show you this little illustration, the little cartoon I showed you in the previous module, where you have the SHPE mission alignment, and I'll tell you a little bit of how we achieve that. For SHPE chapters, really what that means is that you're able to recruit members, you retain them, and you ensure their success. Okay, their post-graduation success for students, the career upward mobility, and positive impact to the community for professional members. And then they create chapter goals. Okay, these are lofty goals. And then they have SMART objectives. And again, I'll talk about the acronym here in a second. You then organize your events and your budget aligning directly to those objectives. And then you streamline your meetings, specifically your executive board meetings. Okay, so here I'm just going to show you the whole thing. Now it looks like a lot here, the chapter schedule, but I'm going to walk you through it. Okay, we're going to take it step by step. So don't worry if it looks like a lot. It is a lot. we're practically, now that's a good question. Why is it so much? Why is this so much? Because you're learning a lot of really powerful tools. And in a certain sense, we are simulating what you would experience in the workforce. The aspect of leading a team, the aspect of leading an entire division within an organization, a multi-million, multi-billion, trillion-dollar organization, requires significant sophistication in the way that you manage the teams. And so we are simulating this at a chapter level. So at a Hispanic student or professional chapter level. So if it seems like overkill or like we're doing this way too sophisticated, I would challenge that notion to say that you are simulating this so that when this does take place at the industry or the academic or the entrepreneurship level, you are better prepared because you have already had some level of experience. You've simulated it already, and you're simulating it with people that you know, which are your colleagues, your classmates, your friends, your members. Okay. And so we're doing this in this format. And so it may seem like a lot, but it really is to ensure the mission, the mission of the organization. Okay. So let's talk about the 3 things that are organized here. We first have the goals. We then have the objectives. And then we have down here the chapter strategy, the organizing and finances. And although I don't have it here because it got cut off, the spreadsheet goes on to a 3rd component, which is the history and the legacy and succession building. Okay. And so, but for now, for the chapter management tool, these 3 major components are sufficient for what we want to discuss. So as I mentioned before, the goals, there's 3 big lofty goals, which is the recruitment goal, the retention goal, the post-graduation success. This is for students only. And then the influence in the career or career upward mobility, and the community goal, and that's for professional chapters only. Okay, so it may look like there's 4, but there's 3. Okay, it's 3 for students, and the first 2 are for both student and professionals, and then the last one's for professionals. Okay. So if you're a professional chapter and you see this template, you are to download the template, use it for your own chapter. You can, completely eliminate these rows for your professional chapter because you're not a student chapter. And then for a student chapter, likewise, you can eliminate the professional one because you're a student chapter. Okay. And then you should notice that these goals are already pre-written for you. That's because that's what we're doing. We're ensuring that we already wrote them for you. So you don't have to worry too much about these goals. You can read them and you can see that indeed they're written in a very vague language. And let's say you read it and you're like, yeah, I could write a better goal. Okay, go ahead. It's not a big deal. Okay. But you should know that these are the ones that we provide for you. Okay. And ensuring that this language is the one that's directly aligned with the SHPE mission. And it is. Okay. But if you modify it, whatever you modify it to, make sure that it's aligned with the SHPE mission. And then we have the SMART objectives. And so for every goal, this is what we call a cascade system. Okay. For every goal, we have a set of objectives. So here's chapter development objective, an academic development objective, professional development objective. If those words are sounding familiar, as in those sound like ship chapter pillars, it's because they are. When you create an objective, you should not just create a random objective out of thin air. The objective should be within the context of a specific chapter pillar. We'll talk about those in the next slide. Okay. And once you create the objective, you can go ahead and write down in the SMART format. We'll talk about the SMART format here in the subsequent slide. And then you'll write you'll write goals for retention as well. And then you'll write some objectives for the post-graduation success if you're a student chapter, or for career and community goal if you're a professional chapter. Okay. Do you need to write a lot of objectives? No. If anything, I encourage you to have a small set of objectives. The more objectives you have, the more events you need to have, more or less, to correspond to completing those objectives. So having a small set is good. But what if you're saying, well, Professor Rodriguez, the smallest set is 0. Like, 0 objectives. Like, no, you got to have at least 1 or 2, okay, objectives per goal. All right. And so I encourage you to have between 2 to 3. Worst case scenario, just have 2. Okay. 2 per goal. Okay. And then we go down here. And down here is a schedule. You can organize it. You can filter it to be chronological. So that way it can go from the beginning to the end of the SHPE year. And then you'll have your objectives. And as you can see, what you have first is this column right here. You'll have your activities. So you'll just list all of the activities, all of their associated events, and you might think, wait, that sounds like our calendar. Like, it is. This is your SHPE chapter calendar, mapped and directly mapping to the SMART objectives and the goals, and also the mission statement. Okay. And so if you never thought about that and saying, well, how do I map my calendar of events? How do I map that to my budget? These are 2 separate things. As you're going to see later on, we map your events directly to your budget. We map it to the objectives. We map it to the goals. And then we map it directly, which aligns directly to the SHPE mission statement. All right. So we're making everything align here as directly as possible, as much as we can. And then once you're done putting your calendar on here, your events, the date of events, the intended audience, write down the intended metric for each one and what the actual outcome was. Now, this might stay empty. This column might stay empty until the event actually gets executed or implemented. And then you'll actually see the outcome, and then you can write it down. And then you can actually have the action item of what's happening next for that event. Who's the lead organizer? Where is it going to take place? And what's the planned budget? The other column that I don't show here right after this is the actual budget column, which actually shows how much the event cost. And so by you having all of this information, you as a chapter leader can stand back and look at this and say, we have a bigger picture of what's happening throughout the chapter. You are beginning to see how the chapter is operating, and you can begin to manage the chapter and say, okay, let's make this decision for this event, that decision for this event, et cetera, et cetera. You can make bigger moves. Many chapter leaders, as I've seen them interacting with their chapter, are very reactionary. They react to how things are happening. And it leads chapter leaders to believe, many SHPE chapter leaders, as applies to both student and professional chapters, to believe that the aspect of being a good leader is to be a good reactioner, to being good at reacting to things. Yes, it's part of the requirements and responsibilities of a leader, but it's not the only thing. The ideal scenario is that you are proactive, right? That you are preventative, that you are proactive in how things take place, as opposed to constantly reacting. That's what a leader does. They are proactive. They lead. They don't just wait for things to happen and then they freak out, right? That's not the way it works, all right? You should be leading in the front. And the way you lead in the front is by gathering the necessary intelligence regarding your business. And the business of yours is to change lives, right? By empowering the Hispanic community, et cetera, the SHPE mission statement, right? And so this is how we're doing it. You can then align if you have specific programs, you can identify them here, for example, and you can double dip on the program per event. And if you have specific and the objectives map to specific events, you can do it here. And this allows you to double dip on the objectives. So you can have multiple objectives, and an event could map to multiple of them, multiple of these objectives, okay? And so just be aware that you have a lot of flexibility here, and you are to use this throughout the year. Again, this is a chapter schedule. It is a habit. It is a system that you use every single meeting throughout the year continuously. You see me moving my hands like this. It's me telling you, you're to use it continuously. It's not something you just set up once, you never touch it again, and then you look at it at the end of the year and you're like, oh yeah, we did like a third of that stuff. Like, no. It's something you should be doing throughout the year, okay? Looking at it, actively participating in it throughout the year. And I'll show you more later how that actually happens. A little bit of background to make you aware is that how this business is operated is how that schedule works is on a strategic, tactical, and operational level. It's these three management levels, okay? And here I just break down what strategic means. We talk about mission, goals, and alignment, the recruitment, the retention, and the member success. This is how we think about in terms of tactical, goal alignment, SMART objectives, and the SHPE pillars. Operational, we do the objective alignment, the events and outcomes, the action items, and the budget. All right, so these are the three layers. So for many students and for the professionals in the room, if you're a SHPE chapter leader in your profession, you're like, yes, I've seen this, I know this, like, yes, I understand, but bear with me as I'm introducing this to students who have been perhaps seeing this for the first time and seeing that this is how many businesses, many industries operate. They think about things about strategic, tactical, and operational. Another way to think about this is in terms of time horizons or time scales. All right. Strategic really looks at the long term game of how to do big moves to making major outcomes achieved. And so in this case, recruitment, retention, and member success. Tactical is on an intermediate time scale. Okay. And the tactics that you achieve to ensuring that the strategy is being obtained. Right. And that's the goals and the objectives and the pillars. And then the operational is really highly localized, the things you do in the short time scales, the act of actually having your events, the action items, the budget, et cetera, that's the operational. If you feel as a chapter leader that, well, it feels like we've been in this box for a very long time and we're still stuck on this box and we're trying to make this box better, it means that your tactics have been very simple, perhaps. And your strategy has probably been very, very simple still as well. And so the way to get further sophistication to bring up the chapter is to incorporate more of these strategic and tactical components to making sure that the operations flow better, not just from one year, but from one year to the next. And that's how you start building momentum from year to year to year. For many SHPE chapter leaders, this seems a little bit, specifically students, it seems a little bit depressing because it seems like they're trapped within the conditions that they have within their chapter for that single year because their tenure is only 1 year. And I would tell you, maybe, but if you make the work now, put in the work now, you'll see that the chapter will grow systematically over years. And after 3 or 4 years, if you come back as an alum, you'll see that chapter, because of your efforts and those of those who followed you afterwards, led that chapter to continuously keep growing. Right, is that sustained growth that requires the tactical to be implemented well, not just the operational. The operational will just keep the cycle moving just in the same orbit, but it'll never iterate, it'll never focus, it'll never grow unless you have the strategy and the tactical components embedded. So SMART, I've been talking a lot about SMART thus far. It's an acronym. Here's the Wikipedia page for it if you want to look into all the details about the history of SMART and other acronyms associated with it. But it stands for specific, S is for specific, M for measurable, A for attainable, R for relevant, and then T for timely. And this is what I mean for each one of them. For SMART, for S, for specific, we mean the 5 W's, what, when, where, why, who. For measurable, provide an analytical or numerical metric. For A, make sure that's attainable, that you have adequate resources available. Relevant, that's aligned to the overall mission and vision, in this case, SHPE. And T, that you have a date. You just got to put a date on it. And so what this objective ultimately becomes is a single sentence, a phrase that covers all of these items. Okay. And so the phrase may get a little bit long, more or less, and you may have to use a few prepositions, a few adjectives here and there just to get the sentence to, it might sound a little clunky even when you read it, but it should be able to capture most of this information, right? The focus is that the SMART objective is something that can clearly be read by a leader and they know what needs to be done, more or less, after reading the sentence. Okay. When it's not SMART is when the sentence can be read and it can mean different things to different people, right? And so the more specific you make it, the more measurable you make it, the more powerful, the more potent the objective is. Okay. And as engineers, you typically want things to be as clear and as specific as possible so that you understand this. If you, as a student, are hearing me say this stuff for the first time, SMART doesn't always apply to objectives. It can also apply to questions. So, for example, if you've been in a midterm, a professional, for professionals, if you ever had a task being given to you by your manager or by your superior, and the task or the exam question wasn't SMART, it wasn't specific, it wasn't measurable, it wasn't attainable, it wasn't even relevant to the exam, and it wasn't timely, then you know you're in trouble, because that question that's being asked to you in that exam can be very, very frustrating, because it can be very, very vague as to what they're asking of you. Right. And you're probably used to this. And then from a superior, if you're a professional, if you're hearing a task from a superior that's very, very vague, it can be very, very frustrating sometimes. And so the smarter it is, the SMART criteria is followed into that question or into the task that's being asked of you, the more you're able to achieve it. Same thing here, the exact same thing here. The more you set up these objectives for yourself, the more likely you are to achieve them. When you set up your objectives, they should be aligned to chapter pillars. And here are the chapter pillars. These are historical, legacy of SHIP. These pillars have been in existence for over 20, 30 years now, and they continue to be a cornerstone of the organization. The student chapters, you have 5: academic, leadership, and professional and chapter development, and community service. For professionals, you have career, leadership, professional, chapter development, and then you have community service, and then you have a 6th one, student chapter interaction. The professional chapters, you have greater flexibility because you have more pillars in terms of your events compared to the student chapters. They only have 5. Okay, so you have additional options here. Do you need to have an objective for all of these pillars? Well, no, that depends on your vision statement that you organize for the year. In this particular year, you may say we want to focus on a subset, the first 5 or the latter 5 of these pillars, and that's perfectly fine. Okay, you're not required to identify all of them inside your objectives. Likewise, for student chapters, you have these 5 to work with. You should ideally work within all of them, but you don't have to. Within your vision statement, you can identify you're going to focus on the top 4 or the bottom 4, etc. What I do want to provide a quick plug-in for sure is that student chapters should make sure that their academic excellence one is always fulfilled in some way or form. If it's not, you're in trouble. So you should always make sure that this one's at least captured. The other 4, you have flexibility, but ideally you should capture as many as you can. Okay, but we are understanding that you may want to prioritize specific pillars over the others. For your goals, as I mentioned here are the goals that I mentioned already in the prior slide when I talked about the spreadsheet. So I'm going to jump over these. And then for the objectives, here they are. As you can see, the language that I'm using for these goals, it's a very long sentence. And here they get truncated off because I only have to clip a certain amount of the picture. But you can see that I'm very specific. These are just examples. If it's in green, it's because it's already an example. These are not the ones that we're not mandating you in any way or form to accomplish these particular objectives, but it's just to provide you examples of what we mean when we say a SMART objective. And so you can read the language later. You can read it on your own in the template, and you can understand, okay, that's the level of specificity that they're looking for when you're writing your own objectives. Okay. It doesn't have to start with the word host. You can make it start with another different verb. Okay. So you create this chapter schedule. It's a single spreadsheet to manage the chapter activities. We give you the template for it. It's got the goals: recruit, retain, success. It's got SMART objectives, calendar of year-long. It's a calendar of year-long activities. It's got tasks. It's got owners of those tasks. You got action items for people, the budget, the funds, the status of what things are going on as you're organizing them. And really what this is a board meeting agenda, and it's used to monitor the progression and the goal completion. And you can use a very simple meeting agenda, which is past, present, and future when talking about your events throughout the year when having your meetings. Okay. So now let me tell you very quickly of how you use this thing, this chapter management tool, to run an effective meeting. You just do the following. You have the following meeting procedure. You have past, present, and future. The secretary of the chapter facilitates the meeting. This is so important because I've seen historically that the chapter secretary position within the chapter bylaws, etc., is seemingly simplified to the extent that they're just taking minutes of the meetings and they may send out one or two emails once in a while. It simplifies or rather reduces the effectiveness and really the potency that a secretary can have within a chapter. And here's how I'm doing that. I'm actually elevating the effectiveness, if you have a really strong chapter secretary, how you can actually make this happen, which is they facilitate the meeting. They're the ones who actually govern how the meeting operates. The president is there. They don't have to lead the meeting. They lead when they need to lead, but the secretary really leads the meeting. Okay. So the secretary provides the updates of the previous meeting. Right. And what those updates are is effectively the link to the chapter management tool. Okay. Because they can read it there. The chapter plan is presented and reviewed for the past event. So past week events. And so, for example, the last week and some of the updates of these events. And then the events, the present events are discussed. For example, the upcoming 2 weeks. You then, as a chapter leader, the president, vice president, etc., what you're doing as a tactical level is that you are redistributing the workload amongst all the committee members, amongst all the board members, and you then identify action items that are recorded onto the chapter plan. Who records them? The secretary. All right. And then the events are monitored for financial and volunteer hours, making sure that there's equal distribution. Why would you do it this way? Why would you constantly want to redistribute the workload? The reason why is to make sure that all the chapter members are engaged in the activities, that everybody's learning to do something. Even if you have, for example, a webmaster or someone that's taking care of IT or someone that's doing an event that only happens once a year, the SHPE convention, for example, and if that's their only position, like, oh yeah, they're the SHPE convention manager. like even if that's the only position, it sounds like that's the only time they're going to be doing their position, which is right before the SHPE convention. This is a way of making sure that that person's always engaged, beginning, middle, and the end of the year, and that there's equitable distribution of the workload. Because as you perhaps have seen or perhaps have observed, is that people can get burned out very quickly. Yes, I'm saying it. I'm making it clear and plain. It's very obvious sometimes that chapter members get burned out from their activities because of the role or because of the roles that they've induced onto themselves, or the position itself requires that of them. You as a leader can redistribute the workload so that everybody's engaged at all times. So if the webmaster's over there hasn't done anything for 2 months, then you can engage them and say, hey, you got to do some other stuff as well, right, throughout the year. And so this ensures unity. It ensures familia. Okay. And so that's the one way of doing this for the present. And it also prevents burnout, overworkload, etc. Okay, people have lives and have a lot of things to do, but keeping them engaged, just 2 hours, a little tiny thing here, a little tiny thing here, many hands make light of the work. Okay, future events can also be briefly discussed, and then the chapter plan is reviewed and the meeting is concluded. And that way you can have less than 50-minute meetings. Okay, and that's the main goal that I had in particular when creating the chapter management tool, which in truth was created based on the habits, the systems that all of you SHPE chapters have taught me over the years. So these best practices are not something that I'm imposing in any way or form, or the National Chapter Program, the Chapter Management Tool is imposing in any way or form. Rather, it is the habits, the best practices that all of the best SHPE chapters, all of you, yes, you are a best SHPE chapter as well, have been doing over the last 2 or 3 decades, and that have taught me, as slow as a learner as I am, have taught me to teach back to all of you. And so I'm just reflecting. I'm a mirror, more or less, that's reflecting back to you the best practices. Okay, so with that, remember the big thing in mind, right? Going back a bird's eye view, the National Chapter Program, it's aimed towards all of us working together to accomplish the SHPE mission. and be able to naturally, organically create a national standard of data and resources and sharing of best practices for the social, economic, poetic, if I dare say so myself, uplift of the chapter members within the Hispanic community overall. Okay, and also in that part, achieving the SHPE mission. All right, so by now you should be able to communicate the value, the national chapter program, know the basics of leading a SHPE chapter, using the chapter management tool throughout the year, why you should be using it throughout the year and you should be using it, and how to draft the strategy for your chapter schedule and your chapter management tool. You'll learn more about that in due time. You can create and organize a workshop for your chapter to draft the chapter schedule together. And of course, you can use your calendar of events already and just copy paste it right on there and use it. And then, draft the goals and the objectives, and then you can take it from there, as well as your budget for the treasurers. And if you have any questions, feel free to email us at chapters@ship.org. And so with that, thank you.